Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first feature-length movie released by Walt Disney, and one of, if not the first animated movie ever. Widely regarded as one of Disney's most special movies, Snow White has nonetheless come across some controversy in more recent years, with many debating over whether or not it stood the test of time and if it sends some rather bad messages to children. Now, personally, I believe people have blown things way out of proportion, and that the movie deserves the respect and gravitas it once had. And today, I'd like to go over exactly why it is I feel that way. But before I get into it, I would just like to give a warning that there are going to be spoilers ahead for this movie. So if you're the one person that somehow doesn't know what happens but plan on watching it, do yourself a favor and come back to this video another day. Okay, so to get right into it, one of the biggest debates surrounding this movie is if Snow White is a bad role model for young people, and especially little girls. And the thing is, on a superficial level, I can see where they're coming from. She's only saved by the woodsman because of his own conscience, and of course, trusted a stranger over her animal friends and took a bite from the poisoned apple. But the thing is, I'd call her more naive than stupid in these instances. And even that aside, I think people are overlooking quite a few important things with that assessment. Because, for one thing, kids seeing something bad happen to somebody after trusting a stranger, and especially after being told repeatedly not to talk to strangers, can certainly reinforce the stranger danger lesson most kids desperately need to learn. But for an argument that's fairer to Snow White, it's true, she's not the most active heroine ever. However, that doesn't mean she isn't to be admired or that she doesn't have a will of her own. For instance, on the latter point, when the woodsman tells her to run, she runs. She doesn't just go 20 feet into the forest and say, I guess this is far enough, and just stay there. No, she's trying to get away as fast as she can, and only stops once she's completely overwhelmed. And let's face it, after what she was just told, and immediately having to run through a dark forest with who knows what inside, who can blame her? And there's also her refusing to feed the dwarfs until they've washed themselves, which shows that she's more than willing to stand her ground when she wants to. And on the former point, there's an important lesson to take away from the character of Snow White that most people overlook, and it might just make her one of the strongest princesses of all. Her undying compassion. Throughout the movie, she's only the nicest she can possibly be to everything she comes across, and is always rewarded for it. Her kind nature keeps the huntsman from being able to kill her, allows her to overcome her fears and make friends out of the woodland animals, find a sanctuary, friends, and protectors in the dwarves, and ultimately get her happy ending, as it was also her compassion that made the prince fall in love with her, thus allowing him to restore her with the kiss. And all of this is on top of the fact that she has absolutely no reason to be so kind. Her parents are dead. Her stepmother hates her. She's forced to work like a servant in rags. Is ultimately told that said stepmother is trying to kill her and has a traumatizing run through a dark forest. And yet, through it all, she remains the kindest, most optimistic person you could ever know. And in that lies her strength as a character. She may not be physically strong or assertive, though even that last part is debatable, but she's got a will stronger than diamonds, and one that the queen could never even hope to break. And if you ask me, that's just as important a lesson to teach children as teaching them how to be physically strong. Because the thing is, so many people either become jerks or do outright horrible things after they were subjected to cruel treatment themselves. And in some of these cases, though generally the ones where they're just not a pleasant person and don't actually hurt anybody, people even say they're justified in acting this way. But Snow White shows us that we don't have to act that way. She shows us that we should still be the best person we can be, no matter what happens or is done to us. Is her behavior somewhat unrealistic? Sure, but this movie isn't trying to be realistic. Her behavior is meant to make us all want to do a little better so that we can act just a little closer to her. And not to mention, she can also teach children to be compassionate, as her kindness only leads to good things for everybody every single time, showing that goodness does pay off in some form or another. But through her trusting and being compassionate to the evil queen and eating the apple, it also tells you not to take this compassion too far to the point that it clouds your judgment or that you risk your personal safety. And you have to admit, that is a pretty good message to send to children. To be nice and compassionate while at the same time being wary of strangers and other dangerous things. And lastly, there's her longing for a prince to come. Though honestly, I think that's just her being human. Because let's face it, 9 out of 10 girls do secretly long for their Prince Charming, as 9 out of 10 boys secretly long for their princess. And I don't think it makes Snow White weak or dependent on him just because she expresses that desire out loud. And even then, she's not so much singing about her prince coming to save her as he is coming just so they can have a happy ever after. And again, as corny and cheesy as it may sound, I have a feeling that people of both genders secretly fantasize about that more than they let on. So why should Snow White be condemned for not being afraid to express what most people are already thinking anyway? It's simply human to want romance, and she's simply stating that desire. And then there's the whole kiss thing, but I'm not even going to get into that. Now, as for the movie as a whole, there have also been arguments that it's dated or doesn't stand the test of time. And in some ways, yes, I would agree with that. It's light on plot, is a little short, and the characters aren't exactly complex. But at the same time, there are two things to consider. The first of which is that it was the first animated movie made with extreme detail, and it is really telling how well the animation holds up even to this day. So obviously they had limitations on what they could do with the story. And the second is when the movie itself came out. Think about it. It was 1937. The world was already falling into chaos, and most people knew it wasn't heading anywhere good. And Snow White was a nice, wholesome, and funny escape from that. In other words, it was the movie 1937 audiences needed it to be. An escape into fun and fantasy where everybody gets a happy ending and evil is destroyed almost literally by the hand of God. It was everything the real world wasn't, but they wished it was. But just because the movie in some ways reflects its time period doesn't mean it isn't timeless. Because almost every movie out there, no matter how small or unnoticeably, does reflect its time period in some way. To be timeless is simply for it to be watched anywhere at any time and still be able to have the same fun and take the same morals away from it. And if you ask me, Snow White fits that description to a T. When people just accept the movie for what it is, instead of complaining about what they perceive as its shortcomings, they feel exactly what 1937 audiences felt towards it, if to a slightly lesser degree, I will admit. Because yes, filmmaking in 1937 is different from today, but that doesn't mean it still isn't good. Because I'll honestly argue that when you peel back the layers of this movie like I've been doing, many might find that it stands up better than most other movies made back in the late 1930s. And finally, there's the behind the scenes aspect of it. Walt Disney put everything he had into this movie. All of his faith, all of his money, and all of the talent he and everyone else working on the project had. And everybody, even his own family, told him it would be a disaster. The critics dubbed the movie Walt's Folly and basically called him a fool. By the end of production, he had to put a mortgage on his house just so it could be released. And even then, everybody thought it would fail. Now, what's my point here? That Walt Disney, for the second time in his life, had all the odds stacked against him. He went into completely uncharted territory with no assurance that it would ever pay off, while being told by everybody he trusted that it wouldn't work and being laughed at by everyone else, with his unwavering faith in the project being the only thing motivating him to keep going. Basically, he believed in this movie and made it in spite of all the laughing and protests because he was that sure of it. And I just have to say, you've got to admire him and the movie as a whole for that. In the end, he proved everybody wrong and made, at least for the time, the highest grossing movie ever. A classic loved by millions for generations after his death, and one of the most famous interpretations of a fairy tale out there. And the only thing he had while making it was his belief that it would work out in the end. Nothing else. You have to admit, that's a far cry from the Disney of the 2010s. So, to put it all simply, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is still a great movie that has most definitely stood the test of time, and even today is capable of imparting morals on us worth teaching. But at the same time, it's also a fun movie that allows the audience to just experience a fairy tale and forget about the real world for a while. And to be blunt for a moment, I believe this movie is not only good, but deserves more respect these days across the board. And they're going to absolutely destroy it in the remake. If you're watching this video after it comes out and I turn out to be wrong, you're most definitely free to correct me. But I, for one, am sure that the live action remake is going to be nothing short of an absolute massacre of the original movie and destroy everything it represents. But if nothing else, maybe it'll help people start to appreciate the original a little more. So that would be one thing, I guess. Okay, that's all I've got on that. So now why don't you tell me what you think? Do you believe Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is not given enough credit anymore, or do you believe it's dated and that aspect of it shouldn't be ignored? Please let me know in the comments. And as always, you don't have to agree with me here. If you think I'm wrong about everything I said in this video, that's perfectly fine. And thank you all for watching. I very much appreciate all of it. And I hope to see you all next time.